Hello class, it's Mr. Wicklehouse, and today I'm going to talk to you about statements of triangle congruence. In the last video we already talked about one of them, and that was side, side, side. But there's four others that go along with that, okay? And the four are, well, really there's five triangle congruence, so let's just talk about them again. Side, side, side. This is side, side, side. Okay. SAS is side, angle, side. ASA is angle, side, angle. AAS is angle, angle, side. This last one is a special one and only works for right triangles. So if you've got a right triangle, then you can say that the triangles are congruent by hypotenuse, leg. Okay? Alright. So let's talk about how these things happen. So we're going to consider the congruence statement of triangle JRB and MNS. Okay? We want to identify all the congruent angles and identify all the congruent sides. This little symbol here, the equal sign with the squiggle over top of it, stands for congruence, and then the little triangles in front of the letters are for triangles. And remember that triangles are identified by three letters, okay? Alright, first of all, let's just draw our triangles here. They don't have to be perfect. The proof is in the pudding, if you will. We just need to make sure that we match things up. Okay, so I'm going to call this one J, R, B, and I'm going to call this one M, N, S. Okay? Alright. So each piece, each letter of these triangles, when I write the triangle congruence, they correspond to each other. In other words, they match up. So J, if I jump over to the other triangle, the M is in the spot where the J would be. The letter in the middle, the R, is going to be, it's going to correspond to the part where the N is. And the B is going to correspond to the part that the S is. Okay. So when I'm talking about identifying all the congruent angles, what I'm going to do then is say that angle J corresponds to angle M and is therefore congruent to angle M. Okay. Angle R, I'm going to do two arcs here to say that it's congruent instead of just one like I did this first one. Angle R is congruent to angle N. Okay. Then I'll say angle B, it's three arcs here. 1, 2, 3. Angle B is congruent to angle S. So if I have two congruent triangles, then all of their angles, their corresponding angles, are congruent as well. Now let's do the sides. Side JR is congruent to side MN. They're corresponding sides, okay? side RB is congruent to side NS. And then side JB is congruent to side MS. Okay. So, we've talked about the type of triangle congruences so far. We've talked about how to match up angles and sides with congruent triangles. Now let's talk about looking at types of triangles and determining what type of congruence that it is. Alright. So here's some examples here. Alright. So this number 1 here is saying that, because this has one mark on it here and one mark on it here, that this side and this side are congruent. It's got 2 marks on this one and 2 marks on this one, so that means the second sides here that correspond with each other are congruent. I know it's twisted and turned a different way, but because of the way it's being marked, then we could say that they're congruent. And then we could say that the third side, we could see with the marks on it, that those are congruent. So if I have 3 sides congruent, then I'll say that the triangles are congruent by side, side, side. That's my triangle congruency. 3 sides, triangles are congruent by side, side, side. Okay, let's look at number 2. You might look at this and you might say, Mr. Wickelhaus, these triangles are not congruent, because the only thing I know is that this angle here is congruent to this angle, right? Because it's marked that way. It's got the little arc on it. And you can see that the lights went out. And now they're back on. So as I was saying, the 2 angles here are congruent because they are marked that way. And then we can see that the 2 sides are congruent because they're marked that way. You say, well, Mr. Wickelhaus, there's not any type of triangle that just has an angle and a side and that it's congruent. Because what we've got here is side, 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 angle, side, angle, angle, side, and hypotenuse leg. Well, that's not a right triangle. Well, how could I determine the congruence? This is where we have to think for a minute. And I have to look at my picture and say to myself, is there anything in here else that I recognize from what I've learned previously to determine if these 2 triangles are congruent? Well, I see this line here, and I see this line here intersect each other. Okay? That means that I can think back and remember that these 2 angles have a relationship between one another. Do you remember what kind of angles they are? These 2 angles, if you remember, are vertical angles. And because they're vertical angles, then I know that they're congruent. Which means then that I've got an angle congruent, side congruent, and another angle congruent. So I can say that these 2 triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle, side, angle, congruency. Okay? Let's look at number 3. Look at this. Again, do you see the vertical angles? Always be on the lookout for vertical angles, because those vertical angles are important to be able to recognize, especially triangle congruency, because they pop up all the time. Okay? So then this one, I've got 2 sides that are congruent, and the angle is in between the two sides. So because the angle is between the two sides, then this is side, angle, side congruency. So these two triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. Always be on the lookout for vertical angles. Okay. Let's look at number 4. Do you see anything that we've been talking about? Yep. Here we go. Vertical angles again. See how often they pop up? They pop up all the time because we always are drawing lines like this. So what kind of congruency is that? Not side, side, side because I've got angles in here. It could be angle, side, angle because I have two angles. It's not going to be side, angle, side because I only have the one side that I know anything about. But when I look at it, and it's like 3 in a row, angle, angle, side. So this is actually angle, angle, side congruence. Okay. All right. Let's look at one more example here. So we've got this rectangle, and they drew a line down through the middle of it, and they gave us a couple right angles here, and they've got this side and this side. Do you think this triangle is congruent to this triangle? Think about it for a second. Okay. So this one's a little tricky. It's a little trickier than thinking about vertical angles. But see this line, this diagonal here in the middle? Well, isn't something the same as itself or congruent to itself? So thinking back to Unit 2, we talked about something called the reflexive property. That said A was equal to A, right? Well, this is true in congruence too, so I could say that this line here is congruent to itself. What kind of triangle is this? I hope you're thinking a right triangle. And if you think back to your algebra days or before, it depends on when you learned it, a right triangle has two legs and a hypotenuse, and the long side is the hypotenuse opposite of the 90-degree angle. Well, that means, first of all, this is a right triangle, and remember I said the last type of congruence had to be for right triangles. If it wasn't a right triangle, then we couldn't do the congruence. But this is a leg, and this is a hypotenuse that are congruent in both triangles. So this triangle is congruent by hypotenuse leg. Okay? So, those are 5 types of congruencies. It's the only 5 congruencies that you'll have for triangles. Side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, side, angle, angle, side, and hypotenuse leg. Always be on the lookout for angles that we know stuff about, and that we've learned before, so vertical angles. Also, always be on the lookout for lines that are congruent to themselves. These two things can hang you up, and you might say, no, those triangles aren't congruent because you don't see them. But if you're looking for them all the time, then you'll be able to remember to check that out. All right? All right, that's all for today. I'll talk to you later.